Some villages hide secrets in their walls. This one hid its horrors in the dark behind them. In the winter of 1854, deep in the Carpathian folds of Romania, a British cartographer passed through a nameless village on a route that no longer appears on any modern map. He wrote nothing about its people, not its buildings, not even its language. Only one sentence scratched in the margin of his journal: "There are no shadows here. They have been burned." That village never appeared again, but traces remain in broken church logs, in ash-filled cellar jars, and in the way birds fly around a certain hill as if afraid of their own silhouettes. They say after a certain hour, no flame would catch, and that shadows, once detached, began to act on their own. You are watching the Withered Ledger, where every tale is a relic of madness, ritual, and silence the world dared not archive. But before we begin, ask yourself this: what if the only thing keeping you human was the thing following your feet? The snow fell quietly, as if afraid to make sound in this part of the world. Father Petru crossed the last bend in the path, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the white, half-melted crust. The road had narrowed until it could no longer be Caledony. Trees here leaned close together. The bark on them was dark, split open like mouths mid-scream. Behind him, the trail had vanished into the mist. In front of him, the village appeared. No name carved into a sign, no dogs barking, no one outside. He had seen strange settlements in the Carpathians before, but this felt prepared, as if the buildings themselves had arranged into hiding. Petru paused at the edge. One gloved hand reached for the worn crucifix beneath his coat. It was habit, not faith, that kept his fingers on it now. The last letter he had received came from the local archdiocese 2 weeks ago. A village northeast of Ursova has reported miraculous occurrences, light behaving strangely, shadows missing. Travel there, write nothing, observe everything. He stepped forward. What hit him first was not silence, it was absence. No wind, no rustling branches, not even the sigh of his own breath. The only sound came from his boots cracking frozen soil. He walked past homes sealed with wax over the windows, curtains of burlap stitched shut from the inside. And then he saw it, a lantern nailed to a post. Its glass was unbroken, its wick intact, but the flame inside was still, frozen mid-burn, as if caught holding its breath. When he touched it, the glass felt warm, but the light did not glow. It merely existed, dull and trapped. A bell rang, thin and distant. The chapel. He followed it through the mist. The church was small, older than the rest of the village. Its steeple slanted, missing the cross. Inside, benches of wood waited empty. The walls held icons of saints with their eyes scratched out. A group of 12 villagers sat motionless across the pews, heavy cloaks, hoods up. Not one of them turned to see him enter. The bell rang again, but there was no rope, no ringer. It was as if the sound came from beneath the floorboards. "Peace be upon this house," Petru said aloud. No one responded. He took his place at the altar, unfolding a damp cloth and setting down the travel chalice. He lit the candles. They flared, alive, then slowly extinguished. The villagers did not react. He raised his voice. "This is the house of God. Speak if you carry no sin into it." Still nothing. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. There were no shadows, not from him, not from the huddled figures, not from the candle flames before they died. The walls were bare of shape, the floor unmarked, even in torchlight. The room refused to reflect anything. And then, slowly, a child in the back turned their head, just slightly, enough for Petru to see half a face, no eyes, only sockets packed with white wax. That night, he was given a room inside the village guest house. It stood at the edge of the woods, barely held together by damp timber and copper nails that looked hundreds of years old. The fire inside was weak but still flickering. He asked no questions at supper. The villagers brought bread without salt, soup without smell. Their mouths did not move while they ate. They did not speak. They chewed with discipline, as if sound was forbidden here. When they finished, they each set their bowls down and walked backward out of the room, heads bowed low. Petru was left alone. The old woman who tended the house pointed him upstairs. Her hands shook as she gestured toward the candle on the nightstand. When he tried to light it, it flickered once, then refused to burn. He awoke to scratching, not loud, not wild, but persistent, like a fingernail testing old wood. It came from beneath the floorboards, under the bed. No footsteps, no breath, just scratching. He leaned down, ear against the plank. Something moved on the other side, not pacing, staying directly beneath him, as if it knew where he would lean. Petru's hand reached beneath the bed. His fingers brushed cold metal. He pulled out a small key, old and rusted. It had a wax seal still half intact, no label, no indication what it opened. When he looked back toward the candle, it was lit, but he had not lit it. And there, on the far wall, was his shadow, stretched long, hunched, and not mimicking his posture. It was looking at him, curled slightly toward his back, like it was reading over his shoulder. Then the candle blew out again. The cellar was not locked. He used the key anyway. The stairs creaked downward into thick mildew. The air smelled like dried blood and something older, a scent with no modern name. His candle finally stayed lit here, though the light did not go far. Stone walls, old crates, and a rack of glass jars. At first, he thought they were wine preserves, but each jar was labeled in ink, names, dates, ages, some were recent, others centuries old. And inside each, something black moved, not liquid, not smoke, shadows, suspended in the glass, twitching slowly, unanchored. One jar bore the name Mara, age 3, another, Ione, tongue removed. A few jars were cracked but sealed with wax. One was wrapped tightly in rosary beads, shaking slightly even though the cellar was still. He stepped closer. The fluid inside the Mara jar began to ripple, as if stirred by his gaze. Then he heard it, a whisper from behind, in the voice of the dead priest who trained him long ago. Petru, it is still following you. He turned, no one. But on the wall, his shadow flickered again, except now, it was missing a head. The silhouette's arms were longer, the fingers impossibly thin. He fled the cellar, heart pounding, knees weak. Outside, snow was falling harder. He staggered toward the chapel to clear his head. But as he neared the church doors, a child stood in the middle of the path, barefoot, eyes wide open, mouth sewn shut with black string. And as Petru stopped, the child slowly lifted one arm and pointed past him, toward the building he had just left. Then softly, with difficulty, the boy whispered through broken stitches, "Father, yours is still following you." Morning in the village did not bring light. It brought gray. A heavy mist hung between the crooked homes like a second sky had descended overnight. Father Petru stood by the chapel's broken window, watching the villagers begin their routines. None of them carried lanterns. None of them cast shadows. The sky was brightening, yet there was no sun. He stepped outside and walked toward the square, his boots crunching over frost that had not melted in weeks. A line of villagers were gathered silently, heads bowed, waiting. Beside a table draped in burlap, at its center sat a single item, a closed wooden box with symbols carved into the top. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat without fire. An elderly man stood behind it, expression blank, his tongue visible only in its absence. This was Katsimir, the elder. Petru approached him with slow steps, removing his gloves. "I want to understand," he said quietly, leaning closer so the others could not hear. "What is in the jars?" Katsimir said nothing, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached beneath the table and pulled out a book, bound in leather, edges charred, a spine reinforced with what looked like braided human hair. No title, just an etched sigil on the front that resembled an open mouth with no teeth. He handed it to Petru. The villagers turned and walked away, one by one, as if their part was now complete. Petru opened the book. There were no printed words, only hand-drawn diagrams, dozens, hundreds, each one more disturbing than the last. One page showed a man sleeping, while a second version of his shadow stood over him, whispering something inaudible. Another showed a row of children kneeling before an altar, their shadows reaching upward like arms of flame. But it was the third image that chilled Petru most, a jar filled with blackness, held by two gloved hands. Beneath it, A sentence written in old Romanian. They are not cast, they are born, and they remember. He flipped the pages faster now. One diagram depicted a village very much like this one, circled by lines of fire, each home marked with a symbol, the same symbol he had seen burned into the cellar. Jars in the margins, tiny notes and faded ink described a ritual held every summer solstice. Shadows were collected, trapped, and scorched in silence. No chant, no words, only breathless flame. The shadows were removed before they could become something else, something unloyal. Back in the cellar, Petru descended again, this time with intention. His candle burned faintly, but held. He opened the book to a specific diagram showing a sealing ritual. Wax melted from the blood of the last bearer, dripped over the lid of the jar while the shadow inside writhed. He examined the shelves. Some jars were colder than others. The one labeled Mara was quiet now, still and thick, but a few others trembled with each footstep he took. He reached for a jar labeled Ione, age 7. Inside, the contents spun slightly, a swirl of black vapor pressing against the glass like breath, fogging a mirror. He lifted it carefully, placing it on a crate. Then he opened the book to a page titled simply, Echoes. A short entry beneath it described an affliction. When a man's shadow begins to remember moments he has forgotten, it will whisper them in reverse. A torment meant to reclaim the body it once followed. And if the jar is broken, the man shall stand still, and the shadow shall move. Later that evening, Petru stood in the chapel, reading from scripture before an empty room. The candles burned weakly. The wind outside clawed at the windows. Behind him, Kazimir entered silently and handed him a folded cloth. Inside it, a sharpened bone needle and a vial of dark wax. Without explanation, the elder pointed to the candles' base, then to Petru's hand. It was not a gift, it was a warning. The ritual must be done, or something would find its way out. At midnight, Petru returned to the cellar. The jar labeled Ione had begun to crack. Hairline fractures traced along its base. The wax seal had softened. He did not know why, but he felt it. The weight in the room had changed. The air was pressing against him, as if his own breath had turned heavy. He reached for the sealing kit, intending to strengthen the wax, but something made him hesitate. The book had said silence, no chant, no voice. But if the ritual was wrong, if the wax was flawed, what exactly was trapped inside? He placed the needle down and leaned closer to the jar, watching the swirling blackness. It pulsed with a rhythm he could not explain. Then the room went quiet, too quiet. Even the candle stopped flickering, and in that stillness, he heard it. A whisper, not from the jar, not from the walls, from behind him. A voice that sounded exactly like his own, but spoken backward. He turned sharply, but nothing was there yet. In the far corner of the room, his shadow had moved. It was no longer where he stood. It had taken a step forward, and then another. It now stood beside the jar, its hand reaching toward it. Petru backed away, his heart crashing against his ribs. He did not remember stepping forward. He did not remember moving at all. Yet his shadow had broken free, and he remained still. In a panic, he grabbed the jar to reseal it, but the cracked glass gave way beneath his fingers. The jar shattered against the floor, blackness spilling across the stone like ink across parchment. At once, every other jar on the shelf began to tremble violently. The black vapor hissed, rising like steam, but it had no scent, no smoke, just a sudden loss of light in the shape of something crawling. Petru stumbled back against the wall. He looked down and saw his shadow reattached to his feet, but it was wrong. It was too tall. It moved before he did, and when he lifted his hand to his face, the shadow did not follow. Instead, it turned its head toward him and smiled. The entity beneath, the sacrifice above, the forest did not let him leave. Petru had traced the same frozen path 3 times now. Once by the stream, where black water trickled under glassy ice. Again past the moss-covered boulder that bore a split like a wound, and once more near the stump with 7 iron nails driven into its heart. Each time, dusk fell faster than it should have. Each time, the shadows thickened long before the sun touched the hills, and each time, he emerged at. The same place, the edge of the village, not the beginning of the road. It was as if time had no spine here, as if the act of trying to leave made the dusk fold inward, knotting the sky and snapping the horizon shut behind him. The villagers had stopped looking at him days ago. Children had gone inside. Doors no longer creaked open when he passed. A wind spoken low pulses through the wooden beams, whispering without voice. Somewhere above the village, crows had begun circling, but no birds ever landed. Not here. On the third night of his attempts, something shifted. Not in the forest, in the light. Petru saw it in the snow first, a faint flicker of motion. Not a shape, a cast, like a branch's shadow, but there was no branch, no moonlight overhead, no torch, only the cold, silver twilight of a dying sun. Still, the shadow moved, not across the ground, across the rooftops. He saw it again near the edge of the square. A gliding flicker darting behind a chimney. No footsteps followed. Just the sway of light where light should not move. Petru turned and ran, not toward his room, toward the highest ridge, where an old ruin was said to sleep under ivy and frost, where once a chapel had stood, long before the church gave the village its blessing. They said no bells ever rang from that hill. They said the stone there had never accepted a cross. And so, with lungs tearing in the cold and boots cracking through frozen soil, Petru climbed. What he found was not a ruin, it was an absence, stone-eaten down to jagged ribs, a foundation half swallowed by earth, and in the center a pit, roughly dug, circled in burned bones, some too large for livestock, some too small for adults. Petru crouched near the edge and peered inside. It went down farther than it should have. The air from below smelled like rusted milk and singed parchment, and something deeper still, a faint heat that did not burn, but remembered burning. He looked up and saw the lanterns. They dangled from hooks driven into a wooden frame that had once supported a roof. 6 in total, maybe 7, each shaped like a stretched pouch, sewn at the sides, hung by coarse twine, and on each one letters, not painted, tattooed, curved, spiraled. Ancient symbols written in shadowed ink on human skin. Petru staggered back and met someone's gaze. A woman stood at the far edge of the ruin, half veiled by hanging roots and fractured moonlight. Her eyes were gray, but not with age, with emptiness, the color of ash just before wind takes it. She said nothing, but her presence closed the air. Petru stepped closer. She did not move. Then, with a voice quieter than his own breath, she spoke. "You have seen it," she said. "The paths that fold, the shadows that move, the voice that is not a voice." He nodded, unwilling to speak. "They told you nothing, did they?" He shook his head. "They never do. They think if they keep it hungry, it will not speak." "What is it?" he asked. She stepped closer, revealing the curve of her cheek and the mark across her neck. A burn, but pale, healed long ago, in the shape of a hand that was too long, too wrong. "They do not worship God here," she whispered. "They fear what came before him, the thing that watched when the world had no dawn, the thing that remembers when nothing else was awake." She paused, her voice trembling. "They are not absence, these shadows, they are memory. Shadows are what the soul leaves behind when light forgets us." "Who are you?" "Mara, the last child who kept her shadow." Petru stared. "They burn them," she said, "every child, before their 10th year, to silence what echoes through them. And you?" "My mother hid me in the salt cellar. When they came, I had no name. I had no breath." She stepped forward now, standing beside him at the edge of the pit. "But now, they will take yours." The sky groaned, not with thunder, with something older, a sound like a gate dragging across bones. Petru turned, and they were there, the villagers, rings of them, pouring from the woods, faces masked in soot, hands bearing torches, jars, and ropes. Mara stepped away, her eyes sorrowful. "It is too late." "Why?" Petru cried. "Why me?" "Because you listened." They seized him, dozens of hands, some trembling, some hardened with ritual. His screams echoed across the stones, but only the ruin heard him. They dragged him toward the pit, tore his coat, drew a circle in ash and salt. Then the jars came, 7, each sealed with wax, each trembling slightly. Inside, faint shapes, rift like smoke pressed against glass. The villagers began chanting, not in Latin, in something before Latin, a language that cracked the air like oil on fire. A liturgy reversed, syllables slashed inward, vowels turned to stone. Petru fought. The ropes held. The circle glowed. Then, his shadow began to rise, not from light, from him. It tore itself upward, writhing, straining against the cold stone. Its outline flickered, thin, screaming. It cast no shape, it cast sound. And then it screamed, not with lungs, with memory, the sound of a mother gasping her last, of a hymn turned backward, of a boy whispering into a well. The villagers faltered. One dropped the jar. It shattered. Inside, no smoke, only teeth. The entity beneath stirred. The pit opened wider, edges curling like paper in flame. Mara turned her face away. Petru's eyes rolled back, and the forbidden hour, the moment when no light exists and no dark is pure, arrived. The village did not speak, but the night did. Petru awoke on cold stone. There was no firelight, no faces, only the low hiss of air moving through the ruined chapel's rafters. He reached out. The floor was wet, not with water, but soot. Warm soot. The scent of burned hair hung in the air like incense left too long on the flame. He blinked. Something was missing. Not something, someone. He turned his head toward the flickering torchlight crawling in from the hallway. His body moved. His fingers moved, but the ground stayed silent. No second outline, no silhouette mirroring his motion. He cast no shadow. Mara found him moments later, standing at the doorway with the firelight behind her. Her eyes held something cracked, not madness, but memory too old to keep wearing its face. "You are awake," she said. "Why am I still alive?" "Because you were never meant to die." Petru looked down at his feet. The light at his back should have cast him long across the stone. But there was nothing, no movement, no echo. "Where is it?" he asked. Mara stepped aside. With one motion of her wrist, she held up a slate-colored object, thin, flat, wrapped in old linen. She placed it in his arms. The ledger of ash, the book, trembled faintly as he opened it, each page stiff with soot and age. Inside were hundreds of names. Each name had a mark beside it, a symbol burned into the page. Some were crossed out with black, others written twice, once in ink and again, in what looked like blood. But near the end, he found it. Petru Ili unburned, escaped. His eyes did not widen, his mouth did not move. But deep inside his skull, something laughed. They had burned his shadow. They had severed it from him, but they had not destroyed it. And now, it had escaped. Mara spoke gently now, her voice almost prayerful. The ritual broke. The entity was not fed. You are now divided. You, the shell, it, the memory. Your shadow remembers things you are forgetting. Soon, it will remember your entire self, and you will vanish. What happens when it remembers me completely? It will become you, and it will be hungrier than you ever were. The hours that followed were not marked by sun or bell. The sky dimmed even at noon, clouds circling with unnatural rhythm. The color of dusk slid across the roofs like oil slick. Petru wandered the village, though the villagers no longer came close. He passed mothers whispering their own children's names backward. He passed homes where doors were nailed shut, not to keep things out, but to keep things in. And then the jars began to crack, one by one, from the cellar of the monastery to the hearths of old widows. The black glass jars where shadows were kept for generations began to tremble. Petru heard them first, not like breaking glass, but like something moving from inside. And worse still, they whispered, not strange voices, not ancient tongues. His voice whispering memories only he should have known. His childhood hymn, his mother's lullaby, the prayer he repeated when he buried his brother, the sound of his own scream in a mine shaft years ago when he had nearly died. They came from everywhere, from beneath floorboards, from inside lamps, from cracks in the chapel wall. And wherever they whispered, darkness crawled. In the square, an old man set his own house on fire. Others followed. Windows shattered, lanterns tossed into basements. They were not panicking. They were purging, destroying any place where a shadow might hide, where one might speak, where one might become. Mara brought him to the well at the edge of the village, the place where According to myth, the first shadow had been drowned centuries ago. It is not just yours now, she said. The others are waking. Petru leaned over the edge. What do I do? Do nothing. You are already forgetting. Let yourself go. If you resist, it will come for you faster. What happens if I let it take me? Then we die faster. But at least the ledger closes. But Petru was no longer sure he wanted to forget. Somewhere deep inside him, something resisted. Something fought. Something remembered that he had once been whole. That the man standing here without a shadow was not a man at all, but a half-death, a memory in denial. He turned to Mara. What were you before all this? She looked up. Her eyes shimmered not with tears, but reflection, like a mirror trying not to break. I was a daughter once. Then I was forgotten. Now I am what remembers. That night, the wind changed. It did not howl, it spoke. The sky split, not with lightning, but with ink, a full, creeping black that bled down from the mountain and painted over every star. The moon did not rise. Instead, the world bent backward. Children covered their eyes, and those who still had reflections found them melting. The jars cracked, not one by one now, but all at once, a roar of glass, and then silence, except, for him, Petru heard his step behind him, and then his own voice. You left me, you gave me away, and they lit me like kindling. Petru turned slowly, but no one stood there, only his shadow, stretching across the ground, cast by no source, moving, as if independent from time that it wrapped around him. It slid up his legs like oil and grief, and then it entered his mouth. He screamed, but it was not his voice anymore. By morning, the village was gone. The monastery burned. No names remained in the ledger. All had been scrawled over, blackened, erased except one. Petru Ile, unburned, escaped, returned. Modern day the year is unclear. The language on the film reel is German. A teen walks through an abandoned monastery near the Carpathians. In the basement, beneath 6 layers of stone, they find a hidden room. Inside it, hundreds of broken black glass jars and one still whole, one jar. At the center of the room, it flickers as if something inside still knows light. And when the camera zooms in, just before the reel ends, a face appears, not pressed against the glass, but behind it, watching, blinking, waiting. Some things are burned to be forgotten. Others are burned to stop them from remembering us. But in that village, fire was never just warmth. It was a language, a warning, a final act of self-erasure. Because shadows are not what follows you. They are what waits for you. They are what watches long after the fire dies. You have been watching the Withered Ledger, where silence is truth, and every shadow tells the story you were never meant to hear. Now you must decide, would you keep your shadow, or burn it, before it remembers something you cannot?